right, day 2 track day prep. So last night I got the driver's seat raised up a little bit. I put the passenger seat belt in, got that all sorted out. Today I pushed the Prelude outside so that I could get the Corolla on the lift. The list for today is actually pretty long. I got to do an oil change. I need to install that Kaaz LSD. I need to try to find a way to modify the factory sway bar to fit on the car. And I also need to raise the back up just a tiny little bit after some testing yesterday. So let's go. What I'm going to start with is I'm going to pull these tension rod mounts off and do the oil change. Makes changing the oil filter a little bit easier. So I don't recommend taking off the tension rod mounts every oil change, but once this is off, it makes getting the oil filter on the Beams engine a lot easier. So now I'll just do an oil change real quick. Team no funnel. So the next thing is figuring out how to get this stock sway bar to fit correctly. Because I've got the engine mounted in a pretty forward position on our engine mount kit so that I could clear all the heater hoses super easily, the front of this sway bar is very, very, very close to the front of the oil pan. So I think what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to cut these corners out of the sway bars and then flip them around to extend the front of this a little bit higher up and then weld it all back together. I'll probably have to do some sleeve tubing over the bar to add the strength back to it, but let's see if that works. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reinstall the bar just to see how it clears, because I don't totally remember. It's been about a year. All right, so I've roughly got this thing bolted in here. Here's what I was talking about. So this is upward travel, but this contacts the front of the oil pan here. So looking at it, I wonder if I could actually just use the adjustable end lengths and make it so that the minimum length of this end link is just before it touches, because the sway bar movement up, which is suspension travel up, is fine because it goes towards the pan here. Obviously, like, I don't want it to smash into the pan or whatever, but this is a pretty significant amount of upward travel on the sway bar, considering it's in the middle of the arm. Let me take one of the adjustable end links and bolt it on there and see if I can actually do that or not. So I think this might actually work. I put the end link on and it does seem to sort of just barely clear everything here. So I'm gonna go ahead and go back in and grease up these bushings and do like a real install of it, just so that I can be sure. But I think this might actually work if I adjust the end links properly. Let me grease up those bushings. So these bushings have obviously never been greased. It's probably not the end of the world if they don't get any grease, but it's better if they do. So I'm just gonna put some energy suspension bushing grease in here. This is the same grease that we include with our 4-link set. All right, so everything is bolted up now except for just the end links on the sway bar. So the bushings are greased, they're tightened down all the way. The tension rod mounts are tightened down all the way again. And I was checking the movement of the sway bar, which I've got quite a bit of travel now because of probably what you just saw me do, which was I just ground off a little bit of the bottom of this oil pressure regulator plug right here, just so the sway bar could go up until it about touches this bolt here. Now it's not actually going to touch the bolt because I'm going to adjust the sway bar end links so that they stop right before that bolt. But now because I added a little bit more clearance there, it gives me a lot more up travel with the sway bar. So when it up travels now, the only thing that it's hitting is the subframe here. But because the sway bar mounts about the center of the lower control arm, the sway bar movement is actually only about half of what the actual wheel movement is. And so I would say I've probably got about 2.5 inches of sway bar movement here, which gives me, you know, on the low side, 4 inches of suspension movement. And because my car is so low, it really probably only has about 2 inches of actual suspension movement in the front of it. So I'm gonna say this is probably good to go. I'm gonna bolt it all together. And when I come back from the track, I'm just gonna go ahead and check and see if the sway bar has been banging into the cross member or if the front of the oil pan is broken off and there's oil everywhere. So that's the gamble I'm taking with this, but I'm gonna go ahead and bolt that together. I'm actually pretty excited that I didn't have to cut up a sway bar and weld it back together. So let me put the end links on. After taking out the 2 locking nuts, now this is all one tightened assembly together. This is as short as I can make this. Now in the full droop position, the sway bar, let me see if I can get it, is just clear of that bracket. See a little air gap right there? That means in a worst case scenario, full droop, it still doesn't touch the oil pan. Now obviously that doesn't account for like the engine vibrating and moving around, but there's almost no cases in which my car will be at full droop unless I'm going over a jump or something like that. So hopefully that doesn't happen. So with the end links installed, now at full droop, that is as close to the regulator as I can get. That means that now once the suspension compresses, it's only going to be starting to move away and closer to the front here. But we already checked and it can't actually hit the oil pan. It bottoms out on the cross member first. So I'm going to call that a win on this sway bar. That was one thing that I really wanted to get taken care of, because driving without a front sway bar, the front end is really aggressively trying to get the car to roll and load the outside tire, which causes the car to be really darty when you're turning and a little bit unpredictable. So this sway bar should help get rid of some of that, especially because I've been using a pretty soft front spring and shock combo. This is only a 6 kg spring, and I had Part Shop Max revalve the shocks for me to be extra soft. So this will sort of handle and calm down the front end of the car a little bit. So now the part that I've been dreading all day is going into the back of the car, pulling the axles out and pulling the differential out. So let's go ahead and do that. So first thing I'm going to do when removing the differential is I'm going to drain all the oil out of the axle housing, and then I'm going to unbolt and remove the drive shaft. Well, that's tight. My buddy Colin Frost was singing Creed all day yesterday, and so now it's stuck in my head. Gear oil is probably my favorite smelling fluid. It smells like peppermint lattes. So unfortunately, the ring and pinion on this car actually is really loud and annoying, but I don't really have it in the budget for this event to replace the ring and pinion, so I'm going to be throwing the LSD in without replacing the ring and pinion, and then eventually down the line going ahead and pulling it all back apart again to change from the 4.3 that the car currently has to probably a 4.1 to make all the gears just a little bit longer. We should also take a minute to note that this exhaust system came on the car and it is not something that I made. I would like to make something nice for this car though. Maybe I'll do another video fabricating a whole exhaust system. So next up, after draining all the oil out, is to remove the drive shaft. Now, one thing that is very easy to forget to do, especially if you're on a lift, is Make sure the car is in neutral and make sure that the parking brake is down, because once you loosen the two bottom bolts, you're going to need to rotate this to get to the other two. So once you take all the bolts off, if you haven't taken this apart in a long time, you're probably going to need to hit this with a mallet to break it loose. But I have had this apart fairly recently, so it just kind of comes off. Now that the drive shaft is disconnected and all the oil's out, what we're going to do next is go pull the wheels off and pop the axles out. These snap-on 3/8 drive impacts simply blew my mind when I first saw them, because there's no way that this little thing with this tiny little battery is going to take off lug nuts, but sure enough. So with the wheel off, the next thing that gets done is the brake caliper comes off and then the rotor. Now, if you're putting a Corolla together that's been taken apart for a long time, I've made this mistake before. These bolts that hold these calipers in place are a very special M10 1.25 with this flat washer on here. It's very special because the amount of thread that's on here, basically how long the bolt is very important. If you take a bolt that's even just a little bit longer than this, it ends up actually pushing into the back side of the rotor. So if you put your rear axle together and you're not using this original bolt, and when you go try to drive your car, there's making a weird scraping noise, it's because these bolts are too long. So make sure you keep these and don't lose them. So when you pull the caliper off, just rest it down gently because it's hanging by the brake line, so be careful with it. All right. The axle has two holes here in the center of it. These are so that you can access the bolts that hold the retaining flange and the brake dust shield to the axle housing. So it's just a 14 millimeter through the hole to loosen the nut. Then you turn it, you get the next one. You turn it, you get the next one. Now, this is a locking nut that's on here, and there's a bolt, aka also a stud, that comes in from the backside. So make sure you're careful. These bolts that are on the backside, they can come out. I'll show you what it looks like. It's a stud that has a flat ground on it, and that flat is what keeps the bolt from spinning because it pushes up against the axle. So don't lose these. I usually just leave them in. So with all of those off, you can see now our caliper bracket, aka dust shield, is loose. Now, this axle is probably going to pull out pretty easily for me because, again, I had this apart probably about a year ago. But it is really common for you to have to use a slide hammer to get these off, which I might actually have to do. So in case you're not familiar with the slide hammer, it's just a big heavy weight on a rod and just gives you an impact for removing things. Kind of like an impact gun for removing bolts. So be careful that you don't pull the dust shield off with the axle, because the dust shield is actually holding the brake line. So we want the dust shield to stay back. All right. So if you're just pulling the diff out and you don't really care about the axles, you can just leave them hanging out like this. And that'll be enough to get the third member out of the car. But it's also sometimes a good idea to just pull the axle out just to inspect it to see the condition. Take a look at the bearings, make sure the bearing's in good condition. What I'm looking for is on the axle spline, it's really common for these splines to get twisted after a lot of abuse. So you'll see that the spline starts here, and then where it enters the differential, it'll actually sort of shift over a little bit like it was twisted at that point. So when I'm inspecting the axles, I'm really just looking at this spline to make sure that it's straight. This one looks pretty good. Just behind the bearing here is the axle seal. It's a rubber seal that's pressed into the housing. Just make sure that it's still sort of pliable and rubbery-ish because that's what's going to keep all the oil in the axle housing. If you notice that you do have oil seeping out from where your axle seats in the axle housing, it's because this seal needs to be replaced. This one's in pretty good shape. I'm going to leave it. All right, so same thing, other side. All right, axles are out. Last thing to do is just unbolt the third member and pop it forward. All right, with all the bolts loose, usually there's some sort of RTV sealant or something here if it's ever been apart, like this one has. It's probably gonna take a couple of whacks with a mallet, but this is gonna leak oil when you pull it out, so make sure there's something underneath to catch that oil. You can see now it's starting to loosen up. Make sure you also have a place that you're comfortable setting it down. So after you pull it out, just go to that place, make sure there's some rags or it's a tray or something that you can set it down and not care if it gets oil on it. So the factory LSD that comes in a Corolla is actually a clutch type LSD, which is a really good design. The problem is that just over time the clutch plates begin to wear, the springs lose pressure, and they need to be rebuilt. So this could probably be rebuilt and used as a perfectly fine clutch type LSD in my car, but I did purchase that Kaaz LSD, so let's unbox that and see how that compares to the factory LSD. I'm actually going to pull the third member apart so you get a better comparison. So when I bought this LSD from Cole, he had just either grenaded a ring and pinion or broken an axle, I can't remember. So he said it's probably a good idea to disassemble it and at least clean it out before putting it in the car. So this is a pretty good opportunity to disassemble both of them so you can see the difference between the different clutch plates and the mechanisms inside the differentials. Okay, let's have a look at the insides of these two LSDs so you can understand why one has more strength and can take more abuse than the other one. So this differential here is the factory limited slip differential from the Koki GTS A86. These are the clutch plates. These are the friction material, the part that bites when it's beginning to slip. And this is the Kaaz LSD disassembled. So the most notable difference between the two is how they bite when the differential is trying to slip. Now the reason that the factory LSD is not as good as the aftermarket LSDs when it comes to its strength and ability to hold the inside tire from spinning in a scenario where you need that LSD to be working is mainly because the clutch plates that are used to create that friction, just like the clutch in your engine, are much smaller and there's much fewer of them. So this is what you've got on one side of the factory LSD. So you've got a friction plate and then a plate in between the two, and then another friction plate. Now what causes this LSD to bite is the spring pressure clamping those together, and that's what locks it up. Now on the Kaaz LSD, it actually has 6 friction discs on each side of it, plus a large bevel or spring washer, instead of just a normal little coil spring like what the factory LSD has. So what this gives you is a much harder bite when it locks and much more strength to hold on to that grip so that the wheels are spinning the same, unlike on an open car when one wheel can spin and the other one can't. So now what I got to do is I got to finish disassembling this Kaaz LSD and clean it all out, put it back together, throw that ring gear on, reassemble the third member, even though that pinion gear looks like trash, but I really don't have anything else to put in there. So hopefully it makes it through the event. But anyway, I'm going to assemble all this back together and then I'll get back to you when I'm ready to put it back in the car. So I almost forgot to show you. Remember how I said that Cole's differential exploded? I think it was either a ring and pinion or an axle that broke, and so we're cleaning it. I want you to have a look at the inside of this thing. There's a bunch of grime and grit, and that's all from whatever that catastrophic failure was. So it's a good thing that I took it apart so that I can clean this all up before I put it back together. So I went ahead and threw this all back together because this video is getting kind of long. But installing it back in the car is basically the same thing as taking it apart. Just clean all the surfaces and put some sealant or a new gasket between the third member and the axle housing. And then again, just reverse order, everything goes back together. I'm not going to bore you with all that, I'm just going to throw it together. With the car all put back together, it was time to load it up and head to the track. But first, I needed to do a couple of figure eights to make sure that the differential was well lubricated. Since I had done so many changes to the car since the last track day, I wanted to head out to the skid pad first to make sure that everything was going to work correctly. I was mostly concerned about the front steering feel with the new sway bar and making sure that the differential was locking up the way that it's supposed to. After I felt that the steering was okay, then it was time to test and make sure the differential was locking up in both left and right-hand turns. I really wanted to make sure that the differential locked in both accelerating, neutral, and decelerating situations. So not only when I was on the gas or kicking the clutch, but also when the car was under braking and slowing down. The next test was more of the same, so accelerating with a clutch kick to lock the differential, and then as I decelerate, using the brakes and turn-in to lock the differential under braking. Everything was feeling great with the car, so it was finally time to head out onto the actual track and do some testing. Apple Valley Speedway is a small and tight technical go-kart course. So the first few laps and most of the first session is really just finding the line around the course and making sure that I can put the car in the right places. It's not so much so that I can be drifting the entire time, but making sure that the car is stable and I can follow the line around the course that I want. Each consecutive lap sees a little bit more speed and a little bit more aggression in driving. Throughout the first and second sessions, most of this was just casually drifting around the course and not really trying to push it too hard. But at the same time, I was starting to learn some of the limitations of the steering of the car. Even though I hadn't taken this car drifting in over a year, and it's never actually really been set up correctly like this, it was pretty easy to finally start getting back into a groove and feeling like I was myself again. The last time I did any real competitive drifting was over a decade ago, and since then I've only really drifted a car maybe half a dozen times. So it really felt great to be back in a car and comfortable and finally able to start pushing myself again. While I wasn't comfortable enough to throw a heavy feint into the first corner entry, what I was really working on was holding an outside line around the track. Most of the cars that I followed throughout the day were sort of holding a mid-line with a mid-entry. But I know that the most exciting line to take on this course is to ride the outside edge because it's definitely the most dangerous. Another cool highlight of the day was, because the event was put on by Ken Gushee and Threes Racing, I got to throw Levin in the passenger seat of Ken's IS300. This is a 1JZ single-turbo IS300 with a cool sequential transmission. So it was really fun to be able to put Levin into a fairly competitive drift car versus having him just ride along in my little Toyota Corolla. I unfortunately didn't get a bunch of extra footage of all the other cars that were there, but it was really cool to see a bunch of Toyota Corollas at the track. There were actually 3 or 4 other Corollas besides me there that day. At the end of the day, I was starting to actually feel pretty comfortable in the car, being able to push the speed a little bit, being able to push more aggressively towards the edge of the track. But overall, the whole purpose of the day was just to go out and have some fun with some friends, and the car did exceptionally well. There was no issues with the car. The only thing that I'm really going to change for the next track day is, like I mentioned earlier, changing that final drive, because on the back section of the track, I was definitely bouncing off the limiter in second, and it wasn't a good position to shift up into third. So probably the next upgrades for the car are just going to be changing the final drive and just playing around with the suspension geometry a little bit. I might even go so far as to adding a steering knuckle or something that can add a little more steering angle to the car, because it's still using the factory steering knuckles right now. I apologize for the lack of in-car footage. I did bring a GoPro that I set up, but for some reason the GoPro footage didn't come out the way that I was hoping, so most of it was not usable. I did, after the track day, buy a newer GoPro, so hopefully for the next event I'll have a lot of good in-car footage for you guys. Overall, this was a really fun track day, and I'm glad that I was able to get the car together and head out to the track before the end of the year. I also wanted to take the time to thank all of you guys that watch these videos, because it's actually quite a bit of work for me to put the extra time into putting YouTube videos together while I'm also running JSP and all of the other things that go on in life. But I made the commitment to be posting at least one video a week, and so when you guys do watch and follow along, it does make it worth it. This is the last video of the year, and if everything goes correctly, I should break the 4,000 hours required to begin monetizing my YouTube channel after this video is released. So I want to thank you guys again for that. Hopefully, I can put more time and effort into creating cool video content for you guys next year. It's going to start off with most likely the Link ECU install into my A86, and as always, the overview and creation of all of our JSP products. Just wanted to thank you guys all again for watching, and I hope that you guys have a great new year.